Hi, and welcome to this Chassis.ml tutorial video. In this video, we are going to take a model container that we built in a previous tutorial, this build a model tutorial right here, download that model container, run the container locally, and then make API calls to that container using a program called Postman. Now, if you've never used Postman before, it's a really great tool for working with and experimenting with different APIs, whether those APIs are written in the REST protocol or the gRPC protocol, which is what we'll be working with today. To follow along, you'll need to install a few things in your machine. The first is Docker. Now again, if you followed along in the build a model tutorial, you would have already done this. You also need to install Postman, and then you also need to install this Protobuf definition, or this model proto file. You can do so directly from the chassis repository. Now, this proto file, or Protobuf definition, is what's used to define how the data will be structured for each of the 3 remote procedure calls that our chassis container can respond to. In other words, there's a gRPC server inside of a chassis container that communicates with a gRPC client, and the way in which the communication happens is defined by this file. Once I've installed all of the dependencies I need, the first step is to pull down the Docker image, again built by Chassis, that we're going to be interacting with or submitting API calls to in Postman. So we'll pull down this publicly available image. You can use this one as well if you're following along. And once it's pulled down, we can confirm that it is in my environment. Indeed it is. So we can now start using it. In order to make calls to this container, the container needs to be running first. So we'll paste in another command that will run the container. We'll port forward the port on which the gRPC server is running inside the container to a port on our local desktop, in this case 5000. And we want to run this in interactive mode so we can see logs printed to our terminal as we're making API calls to this running container. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we point to the correct image, the one that we just pulled down. And in running this image, we see that the server is running on port 45,000, which, as a reminder, is forwarded to port 5000 on my machine. That will be important in a second. Okay, so now that our container is running, let's open up Postman. And we will start by opening up a new gRPC request. Now, in the request itself, there are 3 boxes we have to fill in. The first is the URL that we will be making an API call to. As a reminder, we spun up the container and port forwarded the service from port 45,000 inside the container to a port on my local machine 5000. And so this is the URL that we're going to hit. Next, we are going to select the import Protobuf definition from local file, which is where we'll upload the proto file that we downloaded earlier. And in doing so, we have to give this Protobuf definition a name, so we'll just call it Chassis Proto version 1.0.1 and import this definition. And in doing so, what you'll see is the third box is automatically populated with the remote procedure calls available associated with this Protobuf definition. So in other words, because our container was built using this proto definition, we can interact with it via 3 remote procedure calls or gRPC API calls we'll make to the status, run, and shutdown methods. So let's start with the status method. And invoking this method, we get a response that indicates a successful API call. We get a 200 status code returned, says the model is initialized successfully, and then there's a whole list of metadata provided during the chassis job. Okay, so now that we've hit the status remote procedure call, we are going to test out the run method. Now this one's a little bit different because we actually have to configure an input to this gRPC request. This run method will take in some input bytes, pre-process those raw bytes, run them through our model, and return the predictions. If you followed along in our model building tutorial, where we built a simple sklearn support vector machine classification model, I'm referring to this process method. So everything in the process method is what will now be executed. Postman gives us this convenience generate example message button right here that shows us what the model is expecting to receive based on the Protobuf definition. So what we'll do here is paste in this sample right here. However, we do need to modify what's inside quotes here. In this case, we have to pass through a base64 encoded image because this is an image classification model. So what I'm going to do now is open up a convenience encoding tool. And we're going to pass this image of a dog through. So we'll copy this base64 equivalent, jump back to Postman, and paste this long string of base64 encoded bytes into our input value here within this dictionary object. So now I can run inference, and so we'll invoke the run method. And we get the raw response that our container returns. That being, again, a successful response with the 200 status code, inference successfully executed, and an output results.json with a bunch of base64 encoded results. So as a final step, we can take our encoded results, pass them through our decoder tool, and see the raw output here in JSON format, where we see that the top prediction is a boxer dog with a score of 81%. The next best prediction was a bull mastiff, etc. And lastly, let's check out the shutdown route. And invoking this, we see that the model was successfully shut down and my container is no longer running. Now, in practice, it would be more realistic to make API calls to this container programmatically or integrated in some application. But for testing purposes, just to learn how APIs work and how the chassis containers can be interacted with, Postman's a great tool for doing so very quickly. Thanks for watching this video, and make sure to tune in to our other videos where we will demonstrate how to deploy these chassis model containers to serving platforms of your choice.